Kansas has a minimally regulated late fee framework, consistent with the state's overall landlord-friendly approach to landlord-tenant regulation. The governing law is found in the Kansas Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, Kansas Statutes Chapter 58, Article 25, along with general contract principles. If you're a landlord or tenant in Kansas, the state provides basic structure through the RLTA, but leaves most late fee specifics to the lease agreement. Let's start with the basics. Kansas does not impose a specific statutory dollar cap or percentage cap on late fees. There is no statute that limits the fee to a certain amount or percentage of rent. The fee is governed by the lease terms and general contract principles. Kansas does not mandate a grace period by statute. There is no state law requiring a specific number of days before a late fee can be charged. If your lease says rent is due on the 1st and a late fee applies on the 2nd, that's enforceable. However, standard practice among Kansas landlords is to include a grace period of 3 to 5 days. The key legal principle is reasonableness under Kansas contract law. A late fee is a liquidated damages provision, and Kansas courts apply the standard analysis. The damages from late payment must be difficult to calculate precisely at the time of contracting, and the fee must be a reasonable pre-estimate of those anticipated damages. A fee that fails either test, particularly one that is grossly disproportionate to the landlord's actual costs, is an unenforceable penalty. Kansas courts have a well-developed body of law on liquidated damages. The Kansas Supreme Court has held that the test focuses on whether the amount was reasonable at the time the contract was formed, not whether it turns out to be reasonable in hindsight. However, if the fee is dramatically out of proportion to any conceivable damages, the court will strike it as a penalty. For residential late fees, the analysis is straightforward. The landlord's costs from a late payment are modest and quantifiable, so the fee should be correspondingly modest. What's reasonable in Kansas? The state has a moderate to affordable rental market. Rents in the Kansas City metro, including Overland Park, Olathe, Lenexa, and Shawnee, typically range from $900 to $1,500. Wichita is more affordable, typically $700 to $1,200. Smaller communities are lower. A flat fee of $25 to $60 or a percentage-based fee of 5 to 10% of the monthly rent is generally defensible. The lease must clearly state the late fee terms. The lease should specify the rent due date, any grace period, the exact fee amount or formula, when the fee triggers, whether additional charges apply for continued non-payment, and whether the fee is defined as additional rent. Kansas courts expect written agreement. Oral arrangements are insufficient. Kansas's RLTA includes a provision regarding unconscionable lease terms. Under KSA 58-2544, a court may refuse to enforce a lease provision that is unconscionable. While a late fee in the typical 5 to 10% range is presumptively reasonable, a fee that combines an aggressive percentage with punitive compounding or other one-sided provisions could be challenged as unconscionable in context. Compounding late fees in Kansas must satisfy the reasonableness standard. A single one-time fee after the grace period is the simplest and safest approach. Daily or weekly compounding must produce a total that's reasonable. A compounding structure generating fees exceeding 15 to 20% of the monthly rent within a few weeks would likely be struck down. Most Kansas landlords use a single, flat fee. The interaction between late fees and the eviction process in Kansas is governed by the RLTA and the Kansas eviction statutes. Under KSA 58-2564, the landlord can provide a 3-day notice for non-payment of rent for month-to-month tenancies, or a 14-day notice for other tenancies, giving the tenant an opportunity to cure. The notice periods are important. For month-to-month tenancies, the 3-day notice is essentially an unconditional notice. The tenant must vacate or face eviction. For term leases, the 14-day notice gives the tenant an opportunity to pay and cure the default. Either way, the amount demanded must be accurate, including only compliant late fees. Whether unpaid late fees can be included in the notice depends on how the lease defines them. If defined as additional rent, they're includable. If not, the landlord may need to pursue them separately. Best practice: define late fees as additional rent. Kansas requires the landlord to return the security deposit within 30 days. The deposit is limited to 1 month's rent for unfurnished units and 1.5 months' rent for furnished units. The landlord must provide an itemized list of deductions. Unpaid late fees can be deducted if the lease authorizes it and the fees are reasonable. Failure to return the deposit within 30 days or failure to provide proper itemization can result in the landlord being liable for 1.5 times the amount wrongfully withheld. For tenants receiving Housing Choice Voucher assistance, Kansas landlords should not charge late fees when the housing authority's portion is delayed due to processing. The tenant cannot control the authority's payment timeline. If the tenant's portion is paid on time, the fee should apply only when the tenant's own payment is actually late. Kansas's military population is significant, centered around Fort Riley and McConnell Air Force Base. Fort Riley, home of the 1st Infantry Division, is one of the largest Army installations in the country, generating massive rental demand in the Junction City and Manhattan corridor. McConnell AFB near Wichita generates Air Force demand in the southeast Wichita area. Fort Leavenworth, home of the Army Command and General Staff College, generates demand in the Leavenworth area. Military pay is predictable, and most military tenants pay reliably. Fort Riley's deployment-heavy mission means military families may experience temporary disruptions during deployments. Some Junction City and Manhattan landlords proactively coordinate with military families at deployment to confirm payment arrangements. Fort Riley's constant rotation of soldiers creates unique dynamics. New arrivals, particularly junior enlisted personnel, may be setting up their first off-post housing and establishing direct deposit and allotment arrangements. Some landlords near Fort Riley allow extra time for the first month's payment while setting clear expectations going forward. Fort Leavenworth's educational mission attracts senior officers and their families who are typically experienced renters with strong financial profiles. Late fee enforcement for this demographic is minimal. From a practical standpoint, Kansas's rental market has 2 primary metros with secondary markets across the state. The Kansas City Metro, specifically the Kansas side including Overland Park, Olathe, Lenexa, Shawnee, and Kansas City, Kansas, is the state's largest market. The economy is driven by Sprint, T-Mobile, healthcare, financial services, logistics, and suburban corporate employment. Rents in Johnson County, the affluent suburban area, commonly range from $1,000 to $1,600. Most Kansas City area landlords charge flat fees of $40 to $70 with a 5-day grace period. The professional suburban tenant base generally pays on time. Late fee enforcement is standard but limited to a small percentage of tenants. The Kansas City Metro straddles the Missouri-Kansas border. Properties on the Missouri side are subject to Missouri law, which has a different late fee framework. Landlords operating on both sides need different provisions for each state. This is the same issue we discussed in our Missouri video, but from the Kansas perspective. Wichita is the state's largest city and has a moderate market driven by aerospace, including Spirit Aerosystems, Textron Aviation, and Bombardier Learjet, healthcare, energy services, and manufacturing. Rents in Wichita are affordable, typically $700 to $1,200. Late fee amounts should reflect the lower rent levels. McConnell AFB generates military demand in southeast Wichita. The aerospace workforce provides stable tenants who generally pay reliably, though the industry has experienced layoffs and disruptions that can temporarily affect payment patterns. Manhattan, home to Kansas State University, has a market driven by the university and Fort Riley. The dual student-military dynamic creates strong demand. Student late payments correlate with financial aid processing. Military tenants pay reliably. Lawrence, home to the University of Kansas, has a tight student market. Student late payments follow the financial aid cycle. The 5-day grace period typically covers processing delays. Topeka, the state capital, has a moderate market driven by state government. Government employees pay reliably. Salina, Hutchinson, Emporia, and smaller Kansas communities have affordable markets with limited demand. The Western Kansas agricultural region, including Garden City, Dodge City, and Liberal, has unique dynamics. The meatpacking industry employs a large immigrant workforce that needs affordable housing. Landlords in these communities should set late fees appropriate for the economic reality. Modest rents and modest incomes require modest fees. A fee that's reasonable on a $1,200 Overland Park rent is disproportionate on a $500 Garden City rent. One best practice for Kansas landlords: set your late fee at a level that's meaningful but calibrated to the local market. In the Kansas City suburbs, where rents range from $1,000 to $1,600, a fee of $50 to $75 works well. In Wichita, where rents are lower, $35 to $50 is more appropriate. In smaller communities, $25 to $40 reflects the local economy. Another best practice: include a grace period of at least 5 days, even though Kansas doesn't mandate one. 5 days is industry standard, prevents disputes, and demonstrates good faith. Near military installations, where new soldiers may need time to establish payment arrangements, a 5-day grace period is particularly important for the first few months. A third best practice: if you operate in the Kansas City metro, maintain separate late fee provisions for your Kansas and Missouri properties. The states have different legal frameworks, and a provision compliant in one state may not be compliant in the other. Review each state's requirements and draft accordingly. For the complete guide to Kansas late fee laws, visit tenantscreeningbackgroundcheck.com. Subscribe to our channel for every state in our late fee law series.